Welcome back, fourth graders. We are now going to focus in on this event. This is where we left off last time. We're finishing up on our timeline. And as we finished up on our timeline, we came across this event that was in between our Declaration of Independence, when we declared we wanted to be free, and when we actually became our own independent country. There's all kinds of battles and things that took place in between, all kinds of events. So we took one of those events and we tied it in with our understanding about climate, because we've been studying climate of the Northeast. And we had these vocabulary words, and one word in particular really fits, I think, with this event, the winter of 1777. I bet you could all probably take a guess as to what word matches what you see here in the winter of 1777 and 1778. Makes you wonder, Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, how is that so much similar to Minnesota? How is that alike? I mean, it's a long ways away from where we are here in Minnesota, and yet they experience a lot of the same things that we do with our weather and our climate. So to understand the climate of Minnesota compared to some of the climate that we see in the Northeast, you have to remember back to lines of latitude a little bit. How a line of latitude follows across on a map. It's an imaginary line. And it has degrees that go along with it. So you see that as 40 degrees north. And the further south you get, the lines of latitude getting closer and closer to zero. Like here, for example, is 30 degrees north. And there's 20 degrees north. Where Honey Rose was almost to the equator. The equator line is zero. And it gets warmer the closer you get to the equator. It gets colder the further to the north you go, the lines of latitude. You remember Mr. Van Horn talking about latitude and longitude in social studies. So the colder it is probably because it's in a northern latitude. And Minnesota is in a northern latitude just like the Northeast. We're in that kind of 40 degrees north to 45 degrees north latitude. In fact, part of Minnesota is colder than that. It's actually way up here in the north. It's very close to Canada. And our climates up there are even colder than the climates down in the south. In fact, you see that all the time. You see people up in northern Minnesota having colder temperatures than those in the southern part of Minnesota. But that explains why now in Pennsylvania is very close to that 40 degrees north latitude line. And where Valley Forge takes place, very close to Philadelphia. Remember, Philadelphia is one of those really important cities in the Revolutionary War. That's in a northern latitude, much like Minnesota. So it explains why our climate, our weather, we can relate and understand what the Northeast climate is like. So knowing all of that, I bet that you guessed this picture to go along with the word blizzard. It sure looks like what we know too in Minnesota as a blizzard in the winter of 1777. So out in Pennsylvania, the Army was led by General George Washington. George Washington was an Army general before he was the first president of the United States. And he led what was known as the Continental Army. And the Continental Army fought for our independence, for our freedom from Great Britain. Remember, we declared our independence, but we didn't truly become free until the end of that war, the Revolutionary War. And George Washington was the leader of that. So General George Washington decided that they should stay at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. His army, his Continental Army, had taken a beating. They had lost a number of battles leading up to this. And they thought that Valley Forge would be a good place for them just to camp and set up to get ready for the next main battle. What they didn't realize or count on was this horrible winter that came through. So let's read about that. The winter of 1777 and 1778 was the worst time of the war for the Continental Army. The British had taken Philadelphia. Twice, General Washington had sent his soldiers into battle near Philadelphia, and twice the British had defeated them. With cold weather coming on, Washington had to choose a place to camp for the winter. The place he chose was called Valley Forge. It was just an open field about 25 miles northeast of Philadelphia. Snow was already on the ground when the soldiers arrived in Valley Forge. They put up their tents and began building huts with whatever wood they could find. Before long, they had built 2,000 of them. The huts were drafty, though. They were dirty and they were cold, but they at least put a roof over the soldiers' heads. Each hut had a fireplace, but no windows. The smoke from the fires made men cough as if their lungs would burst. The winter in Valley Forge was terrible. Supplies did not arrive, blankets were scarce. There was not enough food, and with no boots or shoes, the men wrapped their feet in rags. George Washington later said, "You might have tracked the army to Valley Forge by the blood of their feet." An officer from Connecticut explained how bad conditions were in his journal. He wrote, "It snows. I'm sick. Eat nothing. No forage. Lord, 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 cold and uncomfortable. I am sick, discontented, and out of humor. Poor food, hard lodging, cold weather, fatigue, nasty clothes, nasty cookery. Smoked out of my senses. I can't endure it. Why are we sent here to starve and to freeze?" Now look at this. At least 2,500 soldiers died. They weren't even in war. They just died from the conditions. At least 2,500 soldiers died of disease or from exposure there at Valley Forge that winter. That means that every single day, soldiers had to bury 25 or 30 of their comrades. Every single day. Some men deserted, which means they simply sneaked out of camp and went home. At the start of the winter, Washington's army numbered about 7,000 men. And by the end of the winter, there were only about 4,000 men left. Wow, that gives you an idea of how bad that winter was. It makes you wonder, how in the world did we go on to win the Revolutionary War if things were that bad in the winter of 1777? Well, George Washington did make a comeback with his troops, the Continental Army. But for now, they were staying. They were staying here in Valley Forge through the winter. Besides that article about Valley Forge that we just read together, there's also a short minute and a half video that gives you some of the history of Valley Forge and talks about that winter. And from that information, from the article that we read together and from this video, you're going to write down some information, some things that you learned about that winter and what it was like for those soldiers, some of the history of that time. And the climate, as you know, much like we have here in Minnesota, probably you can understand. You know what it's like to live through bad winters. All right, well, good luck, and we will see you again tomorrow.